associate professor of Soviet history at Stanford University. He's an accomplished scholar in the field of Soviet studies, and he authored numerous articles, including a study of the life cycle of the Soviet Revolution, a consideration on Prague Spring, Romanian Summer, and Soviet Autumn on Russian Western frontier, and an analysis of the Soviet system and the brutalization of warfare. In addition, he annotated editions of 2 volumes of archival documents in both Ukrainian and Russian, which suggests that he mastered both languages. You come to the same conclusions about his language skills while reading any of Dr. Weiner's 3 books. His The Second World War and the Fate of the Bolshevik Revolution is particularly interesting for the Ukrainian public. There is a chapter on Vinnytsia and, more globally, a peculiar view of the war's impact on the Soviet state, namely interpreting the Soviet regime as an outcome of the Enlightenment's idea of human perfectibility. Dr. Weiner suggests that the Second World War experience became the revolution's Armageddon. During the war, the persistent goal of the Soviet project to eliminate unproductive and dissonant elements took another and a ferocious turn when party ideologues anticipated the coming of the communism. But instead of class enemies, the regime turned against selected nationalities and, no longer convinced of the malleability of human nature, removed them physically from Soviet society through exile, imprisonment, and execution. And this biological turn from the social determinism of Marxism allows Dr. Weiner to interpret Stalinist purges as excision. Today, Dr. Weiner will deliver a public lecture on his newest research project, and I have no intention to further delay this exciting event. So, Dr. Weiner, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much for the kind introduction. Thanks for having me, and we feel all of us, like my colleague, honored to help in any way we can in what you are all experiencing right now. What I would like to talk in the next few minutes, about half an hour, 40 minutes, is about a project that was just concluded, a new history of the KGB, under the title At Home with the KGB. And few things just to start with, what brings us to the KGB. It is one of the most talked about agencies in history, spy agencies. It is in the unholy trinity of the Soviet history. It's the Gulag, Stalin, and the KGB that came to symbolize the Soviet system. So what else to be done? So to start with, I focus on the domestic policies and operations of the KGB, and this needs emphasis because most of the books that we have until now are still either on the Stalinist era, and justifiably so, or on the Soviet espionage, so the KGB activity abroad. But I would argue the KGB was most influential and had much more impact on the domestic arena, because unlike the foreign arena, where it had to cope with factors that were beyond its control, other sovereign states, in the domestic arena, it enjoyed almost unlimited control over society and politics. It was one of the 3 pillars of Soviet communist totalitarianism. The one is the political arrangement of single-party dictatorship. The second is the non-command, non-private property economy, and both of them are held by some kind of state terror, in this case, the KGB. So without this organization, without this pillar, the 2 other fundamentals of the Soviet system would not agree. Second, it is a fantastic tale of an organization that started with universal pretension, with universal outreach, ended up in a parochial whimper, and was reborn now more powerful than it has ever been. To start, for instance, to give an example, and from one of the most famous cases, I don't know if some of you are familiar, but at the time, the leader of the Zionist movement arrested in Vilnius by the Soviet security agents. And during interrogation, Menachem Begin recorded it, and we have both his stenogram of his interrogation and his memoir. He's being warned that he will pay with us, you pay not only for your actions, but also for your thoughts, something that stunned him at the time. And it goes on and on, this interrogation. It was not violent, he's not tortured, but except for psychological terror that is inflicted on him. And at a certain point, when it reached the climax that he loses his composure, he's trying not to antagonize his interrogators, and he asks him, how can you even detain me or accuse me of Soviet crimes against the Soviet Union when I'm not even a Soviet citizen? And the reaction of the interrogators simply, they're stunned. Oh, you are such a strange fellow, Menachem Wolfowitz, Chudak. Don't you understand that with us, it's only a matter of time until we reach to a person anywhere in the world or he is reaching to us? This is the universal pretense. Fast forward, we move 40 years later, and we find that KGB units in Gorky Oblast are dealing with nonsense, like checking whether the lack of collection of, excuse me for the phrase, chicken shit from eggs factories has adverse impact on the quality of the eggs. And the inspectors, the KGB inspectors who are checking this branch of the KGB are saying, is that what you are dealing with? And the reaction is, yes, this is part of our political plan, etc. And they are stunned. But from here, from this universal pretense to the nonsense of checking on the collection of chicken shit. And as we move to present day, with the successors of the KGB, and especially we're talking about the Russian Federation with the FSB, we are now witnessing the phenomena of the transition from a state with security organs to security organs with a state. So that's also part of the KGB and its legacy. Third, what fascinates me with the KGB, it's a tale of an organization that twice in its career is forced to change course 180 degrees and restructure itself, and twice when it is at the height of its power. In the early 1950s, it demolished all opposition in the Soviet Union. All anti-Soviet partisans are basically killed or in the camps, and it is ordered to change course and restructure itself completely. 30 years later, when it is again at the height of its might, the height of its power, it demolished all the dissident movement, feeling very good about itself, as its internal reports show us. And then it is ordered again to change course. In the first time, it succeeded. It adjusted itself and adopted to the change of times. In the third, it's imploded ingloriously. And it's a question that we have to ask ourselves, was it smart to change such an organization? Was it right from the Soviet point of view to do that? Finally, the point that brings me to the KGB, this is a tale of a security service organization with a distinct identity. It is based on an ethos where everything mattered and everyone counted. And this was responsible for, on the one hand, unprecedented collection of material on society and unprecedented penetration of society on the one hand. And on the other hand, it was responsible for astounding waste, loss of focus, and simply redundancy that cost it dearly when it came to crunch time. So a lot of questions to ask about the KGB. What did he know about Soviet society? How did it get its information? How did it recruit agents? How did it train its own officers? Was it indeed immune to the own conspiracies that it produced? Was it immune to the material that it collected from the West? It was the vanguard of collection of material that it was considered subversive for Soviet citizens. How did they keep themselves immune to this material? How did they cope with the decline of legitimacy of the Soviet system and the Communist Party? And of course, why and how the KGB is the only Soviet institution that survived one way or another into the post-Soviet era. So what I would like to do in the next 30 minutes, is to focus on three moments in the history of in the tale of the KGB. One is, who are the officers who joined the KGB, sort of their collective profile. Second, the method of operation. And third, the critical moment of the decline and collapse. So to start with, who were the KGB officers? Quite interestingly, the image that we have of the KGB officers was given to us mainly by the dissidents, their victims, those who put things into writing. And the image that we get, of course, is not flattering. It is not unified, it is not a one image that we have, but very often they are clumsy, not uniquely intelligent, very rough, ruthless, one-minded. Needless to say, not the most positive, even from those who appreciated their professionalism and determination. Needless to say, this is not the view of the KGB of itself, and I would say also that we have to take it into account. The KGB officers view themselves, and they are trained to look at themselves as an elite order. Very often they use, when I sat down with them for interviews, read a lot of the documents, everything that I'm talking about today is based on years in the former KGB archives in Ukraine, the Baltic states, Moldova, Belarus, and a little bit in Russia. When we listen to them, they refer to themselves as an order, a knightly order, very often military order, an elite organization that was above society, that was almost detached from all the malaise, all the problems and the warts of the Soviet system. There is a certain arrogance to it, and sometimes when they talk about other Soviet citizens, there is quite a condescending view. When they talk about the party bosses, party officials, it's even more condescending. And this is quite interesting, and I'll get to it in a moment, because they are all communists, but nevertheless, they distinguish themselves from the party apparatchiks. As they all say, whether they deny that they were above others, they don't like to hear that they were elite, but they actually give us all the ammunition to say that that's how they thought about themselves. And of course, they denied that they were elite, but at the same time, we were the guys who went to the opera. We were the guys who who read books. And after all, they recruited only the best sons of the motherland to the organization. And it comes off very often, even by those who don't like to present themselves as elitist. Second, and very, very interesting, their identity is based on negation. Almost every KGB officer that I sat down with for an interview, and here I have in mind several Ukrainian KGB generals, among others, started with a statement. Before we start talking, I would like just to make the point, we were not the NKVD. We were not the Gestapo. And that's without even me asking them to say anything. And some of them, more literary, more historically oriented, said, who blames the present-day Catholic Church for the crimes of the Inquisition? So the main point is that they distinguished themselves, that they were not the thugs, they were not the bone breakers of the Stalinist era. They were different. And this is something to keep in mind, how they view themselves and how they act. They do not present themselves as a wishy-washy. They don't talk about the KGB as an educational organization. They said it a priori. We were not an educational organization. We were rough. We could be tough, but we were not thugs. We did not break bones. So the question is, why did they join an organization that did not have such fame in Soviet society? It was feared in many families. When the kids came home and said, I was recruited for the KGB, the reaction of the family is quite horror, quite apprehensive, not necessarily supportive. And they know about the history of the Soviet security organs. They don't deny it. The three leaders of the KGB, when they are appointed to lead the organization, actually try to get away, to get out of this. If we talk about Shelepin, the man who actually created the KGB, in the modern KGB, as we know it, when he's told by Khrushchev, and they're always told, nobody asks them if they want, you are the leader of the new chairman of the KGB, And he said, why me? I'm young. What have I done? When I walk by the Lubyanka, I take a loop because I'm so afraid. He tells it to Khrushchev. His successor and his also apprentice, Vladimir Semichastny, when he's offered, it's almost the same. I'm so young. I don't know anything about police. Can you take someone else? And Yuri Andropov, the mighty Yuri Andropov, who chaired the KGB for 15 years and was a very powerful apparatchik, when he is told, and he's summoned to the Politburo just simply to be told by Brezhnev, you are the new chairman, he tells him, can you find someone else? Maybe someone who knows better the work they don't want, and they feel a lot of horror. And he, as he tells some of his close friends, I still had nightmares when I entered the building in the first evening. They're all there, young lieutenants also, they are familiar with the Stalinist legacy, but they join nevertheless. Why? Almost all of them confess to have certain romantic notions of the KGB. They are brought up by pop culture, the Soviet pulp fiction, which is very pervasive, on books and films that glorified the KGB, celebrated Soviet spies. Many of them cite 17 Moments of Spring. Many of them say, yes, I wanted to be Stirlitz, the famous the Soviet James Bond, as we would call it. Vladimir Putin himself said, I was taken by Bagnoni's role, Donatas Bagnoni's role in Myortvi Sezon, the Dead Season, the great spy movie from 1968. They are mesmerized by this romantic notion of espionage. They want to become spies, they want to catch spies, all these romantic notions. For others, there is simply the notion of, especially if they come from the periphery, from the small town, of economic or social upward mobility, climbing up in the ranks, getting out of the dreary life of the provinces. There's not much economic incentive at the beginning. Only when they will join the nomenclatura, they will start having the good life and the power of the KGB. Until that time, this is not the main reason, but the main thing is to get education and to start having better life in the ranks. For many of them, there is the family tradition. The KGB recruits people who are sons or brothers of other officers, and this is the nucleus of the organization. So this is another motivation to join the organization. But they can fantasize as much as they like about becoming spies and catching spies. It is not a voluntary organization. They are recruited, they are vetted, they are verified. The KGB studies its recruits very closely for several years. The main pools are the military, the party, and the Komsomol, and they go back in the history of the family and the personal history of the person. We have nowadays in our possession the manuals how to vet a person, a candidate for the KGB, and they studied everything from the grades in high school to sexual habits, to drinking habits. These are questions that are directed to the wives and girlfriends of these candidates. They don't spare anything when they check the history of the person, and mostly they get it right because there are not many failures of people who get there. There are not many defections. This is a highly educated organization. They are not intellectuals, but they are all with high education. At the end of the Soviet era, the KGB is probably the most, except for the Academy of Sciences, is the most educated Soviet organization. And we have to remind ourselves, because very often we hear from the dissident who were subjected to the KGB terror about this thuggishness and clumsiness, and they confuse them. They were not supposed to be intellectuals, but they know their trade very well, and they are trained very thoroughly in their academies. At the time, it's called the higher schools of the KGB all over the Soviet Union. And when they recall their training and we look at the way they were trained, they were indeed processed very professionally and very thoroughly, prepared them for their field work. One thing that is very important and very often was glossed over by scholars of the KGB is the cohesion of this organization. This is something that was cultivated in the organization from day one, that it is an order, that this is almost like a family. The officers take care of their lieutenants, of their subordinates very, very carefully. And very often when we hear them talking about it, they remember it very fondly, that someone takes care of you. There are a lot of rituals and ceremonies that are cultivated in order to bring them together as an organization, the esprit de corps of the organization, and they stick together. This is something very important. I'll give one example, that one of my favorites, one of many. This is not from Ukraine, this is from Latvia, when the head of the the directorate, the fifth department that deals with dissident, he was a Germanophile of a family of German origin, and they celebrated his birthday in a sauna not far from Riga. So all the guys are waiting for him. They're already drunk, naked in the sauna. He enters the sauna and he sees the guys there sitting, slobbering, and he raised his hand and said, "Heil Hitler." And the guys simply said, "Heil Hitler." And this is in the KGB. Now try to imagine what happens to a Soviet citizen who does it on the streets of Kyiv, Lviv, or Riga, or Moscow, simply give a Nazi salute. This is something that would not end up with a smile and another shot of vodka, but they feel comfortable that nobody will snitch, nobody will talk about. This is among the guys. This is between the guys. And this is just one juicy anecdote, but there are so many others that they cover for each other when there are certain flows or deviations. They are there together. One thing very important to remind ourselves, they do not regret joining the KGB. And the defectors are almost non-existent. We can almost name them. The people who left the KGB, the people who crossed to the other side and helped opposition people. No, and I'm not talking about when the Soviet Union was going down and the bank run started, talking about the 1970s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. We can barely find anyone who deviates and betrays his position. Second point that I would like to mention about their methods of operation. Of course, they do many things, but the one that is celebrated most is prevention, prophylactic measures. This is the one thing that they all pride themselves, that the KGB was not about arrest. Their goal was not to refill the camps again. The main goal is to prevent crimes, to prevent people from being arrested. As the motto was, do not create enemies, prevent one from becoming an enemy. And they take it very, very seriously. The main thing is to identify potential troublemakers, bring them in, warn them, terrorize them enough, but not that they will not repeat or renew their activities. There are several venues for this method which engaged hundreds of thousands of people throughout the 1950s all the way to the late 1980s. There is the prophylactic chat, beseda, which is usually done either by KGB officer or a trusted person. And the person is invited, and I will describe it in a moment how it really works, but more or less being warned, stop doing what you're doing or else. If the person persists and is a little bit stubborn, then there is communal social prophylactica, when it is done very often in the working collective in front of hundreds, very often, of co-workers, and with a panel of KGB officer, the directors, the principal of the university, of the school, or director of the university, it depends where it happens, when the person is subjected for an hour or two of being pummeled by this humiliating assault on her character, trying to break them down, and usually it works. Very few people sustained the pressure and did not recant. And then there is prophylactic operations that take years, and these were directed especially against dissidents. And the main thing is not even the person itself, but trying to reach to other people, trying to extract some public condemnation of the movement, or snitch on the others, recruit them as agents. But two things about prophylactica that stand out, and it created some consternation inside the KGB. One, this is an extrajudicial process. What does it mean that you have a person who is not guilty and not innocent? It is somewhere in between. It's in the gray zone of legality, something that sometimes troubled them. What exactly are we doing here in this business? And it became an issue as we progressed into the 1980s. Second, with prophylactica, there is also a concession that marked the difference between the Stalinist and the post-Stalinist era. There's a concession here that they don't care about what people think. It is only what people do. As one Ukrainian KGB general tells me, we didn't care much about what people said behind closed doors in the kitchen or under the blanket in their bedroom. If they said them with down with the communists, Doloi Komunisto, that fine if they said it. No, if they say it in the town square, if they say it in the factory, then we move in and start doing our prophylactica business. From their point of view, they look at it as they're doing a favor to the person by preventing a person from getting into serious problem. And very often when I sit down with them or sat down with them, they tell us about the people who still come stop them on the street and thanking them for preventing them from getting into serious problems, and they take it seriously. Some of them go a long way and describe the entire prophylactic experience as an exchange of ideas that they always succeeded in persuading, convincing the other side of not repeating this messy behavior. And go figure, it sounds like almost like an academic seminar, which of course we have to take with a grain of salt. But in reality, the prophylactic measures are sinister psychological terror. And let me give an example of a real case, but there are hundreds like him that all of them recorded. And this is a case of a person who is now a professor at a certain university. I will not name names today. And he's writing on his one day on the walls of his high school, down with the communists. Doloi Komunisto. 2 days later, he's summoned to the principal office, and then there is a guy who identified himself as Captain Ivanov from the KGB and the principal of the high school. And they ask him, Stepan, why did you do that? And Stepan still thinks that he can get away with this, and he says, I didn't do it. And the person who identified himself as Captain Ivanov leans forward and said, Ivan, shut up. Let me tell you right now, we know that you did it. And what I want you now to, first of all, to promise us that you are never going to do it again. Second, we want to know the names of everyone who was with you, who were with you at the time, who were co-culprits in this business. And Stepan thinks that he still can get away with this and said, I don't know what you're talking about. And then Captain Ivanov leans forward again and says, listen to me, young man. Here are the options. Do you know the other guy, Igor, from other school? He just took his entrance exam. He tried to get to MGU, to the primary university of the Soviet Union at the time. He didn't make it. You know where Igor is now? He's in the factory. And quite likely he will be mobilized. He will be drafted to the army soon. So what do you want to do, Stepan? And you know what Stepan does? He confesses and he promises not to do it again, and he gives the names of everyone who was with him because he is shattered. And it is 99.9% success in this business. And when he leaves the office of the principal, he is traumatized, not by only the fact that almost his entire future was put in danger, but also the question, who snitched on him? Who among his friends was the one who told about him? In this specific case, it was his girlfriend. It was his girlfriend. So basically, what we have here with the prophylactica, it is not violent. It does not get the person into legal problem, but it terrorizes them psychologically, and it shatters the social fabric of society. It shatters all trust. In many ways, it sounds like the mafia movie. I don't know if people are familiar with this, with The Godfather. I'll make you an offer you cannot refuse. And in several cases, when I interviewed the KGB generals, and again, some of them, here I refer to Yevhen Marchuk, when we talked about prophylactica, and I told him it sounds like this very famous line of I'll make you an offer you cannot refuse from The Godfather. And he said, oh yeah, my favorite film. So much for prophylactica, and let me conclude now with the third moment of how they treat the collapse of the Soviet Union, which will lead us also to present day. It overshadows everything that they remember and they write about, and also the documentation of the KGB inside. The decline and collapse is a shock for the KGB officers. They are, after all, the shield and sword of the party, of the regime. They're sworn to protect it. And when the decline starts, the KGB is at the height of its power. It is a modern organization with vast network of informants, agents. It is moving to the era of computers. It is completely in charge. It demolished completely the dissident movement. It feels very, very good about itself, and then the collapse starts unraveling so fast. So what are the factors that contributed to the decline and collapse of this powerful organization? There's not a single factor that we can put out that necessarily, of course, a combination of several. Let me mention a few. By the mid-1980s, the KGB is becoming victim of its own conspiratorial worldview. It is engaged constantly with conspiracies. Some of them are its own making, some of them are simply coming from the outside. But basically, the understanding that they are subjected to a constant attack by external enemies who finds their agents of influence, their collaborators inside the Soviet Union, derails them into the rabbit hole of conspiratorial mind and sways them away from the focusing on the real problems of Soviet society. So when they're talking about Soviet youth being influenced by Western propaganda or by the Ukrainian national diaspora, etc., they don't actually focus on why these youth will look out for this inspiration. What is there? Why are they looking for other sources of excitement? They cannot point, they simply cannot bring themselves, because then they will have to ask their own existence and the core of the system. But this is the price tag that they pay for all these conspiracies. One of my favorite is that, and this is from the Ukrainian archives, in 1990, one of their last publications, inside publications that they teach the cadets in the academies of the Soviet Union, is they are taught about Zionist conspiracies to bring down the Soviet Union. Sound very interesting, except that this is the time when the Soviet Union already defrosted its relations with Israel. It's about to reestablish diplomatic relations. There is a honeymoon between the countries, but still inside the KGB, they are studying Zionist conspiracies. Second, they all argued that foreign information did not have much impact of them. Some of them tell me that actually how much they admire this or that American or British rock bands and all the movies that they're watching. They claim that it had no impact on them. I'm slightly more skeptic. They stayed until the very end, most of them, but there is the drip of impact that is there that simply offers them an alternative source of information that most other parts of society lacked, and that was a problem. When Glasnost starts, for them it's a shock. They support Gorbachev reforms. They understand that there is a problem in the Soviet system. They do use the word stagnation already then, but Glasnost for them, unlike perestroika, is that the KGB for the first time is forced to play defense. It finds itself under constant public attack, something that it is not used to, and the rules of the game changed. It has to defend itself now in public against its criminal behavior, illegal behavior, starting with the Stalinist era, but now moving to the present of what they were doing, and it's a problem that rattles them. But beyond that, what the most important, I would say, in ranking order, is that they feel that they are abandoned by the party, that the Communist Party, which led them and ruled them for all these years, is quitting, that Moscow is simply relinquishing its demands and on the Soviet Union as a whole, and the Communist Party is relinquishing its aspiration to lead the Soviet politics and society. I'll give you an example, and this is from the late Yevhen Marchuk, that I sat down with him for a long time, and I asked him, when did you realize that it was all over? And Marchuk is a very intelligent person with quite a sense of humor, and tells me, this is a tale of two giants. And I tell him, what do you mean by that? And he said, two tall people who made me understand that the Soviet Union is going down and we have a different business now in play. One, that I was watching TV in this one day, and I see this giant of a person crossing the Brandenburg gate in Berlin and behaving like the boss there, like the Chazyain, and nobody is doing anything about it. And I said, what the hell is happening? How on earth he behaves like the boss in Eastern Germany? He was talking, of course, about the German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, and indeed a very big guy. And asking him, and what about domestically? When did you know that things are going wrong there? And he said, it has to do with another tall guy. His name was Alexei Myakota, the obcom secretary in Poltava region. And he said, this was a time that we were ordered by the party to start meeting the people. And I come to his office one day and he tells me, Zhenya, we have to go meet the people to talk with activists and the representative of the people. And I said, okay, let's go. And we enter the big auditorium and he suddenly grabs my arm and said, Zhenya, you stay with me, don't move. And I realized that this big guy was afraid. And Myakota ruled Poltava with an iron fist. He was a man who was revered and feared at the time. And here, the KGB boss of the region, who will go on and become the deputy chairman of the KGB Ukraine and the first chairman of the SBU, is indeed sensing the fear and the collapse of authority of the party, and things begin to look different. And we see all over the Soviet Union, when the putsch of August 91 comes, that the KGB is sitting mostly on the fence. Their leader is leading the coup, but most of the KGB in the branches and in the republics is sitting on the fence and also negotiating between the extremists. The main goal is to prevent the bloodletting. They understand that the regime is going. They are not necessarily Democrats or liberals, but the main thing is to prevent a civil war and to see where it will lead. Finally, there is something, and that relates indeed to the putsch, the last opportunity to reverse the course and maintain the Soviet system in place, to keep it in place, that I use the term that the Bolsheviks used, they become vegetarians. They lost their taste of blood, the very same KGB. This is an organization that for decades stopped shedding blood. If we look at what happened in the putsch in August 1991 in Moscow, 3 people are killed by accident when a tank commander panicked and opened fire on 3 protesters who climbed on the tank. And the reaction in the Lubyanka of Khrushchev, the last chairman of the KGB, is panic. He's panicky. What the hell happened? How could it happen? Putsch is not supposed to be, this action is not supposed to be about bloodshed. This is a provocation. Who is responsible for this? Can you imagine Lavrenti Beria or Ivan Serov or Shelepi or Semichastny shedding a tear or getting panicky over 3 people? Certainly not. 300 would be a start. 3,000 will be business, but this is simply a different organization. Last word, and I'm concluding here, about the afterlife. Why do we have the KGB basically now in power, the former KGB veterans in power? When the Soviet Union collapsed, all Soviet organizations went out of business. The Communist Party, the Komsomol, the trade unions, all of them vanished. The one organization that was kept is the political police. And the KGB was a political police. This is the one that was kept. It was reduced very draconianly in terms of numbers, from 750,000, including the border guards, but more or less 500,000 officers and agents, to about 138,000 in almost a year. It is reduced in numbers, it is renamed, it is restructured a bit, but it is kept. There is a political police organization, and it is subjected to the president of the Russian Federation. This is an organization that is now the nucleus of the diehards remain there. People with the certain ideology, stated ideology, strongly anti-Western, in many places, and not only in Russia, and this is important to remind, also in Ukraine, they hold onto the doctrine, the ideology of the Ruski Mir, the Russian world, the unity of the Russian-speaking people, and all of them are loaded with the conspiratorial worldview, especially as it comes for the West and its agents of influence. But it remained there, and it was used by each president of the Russian Federation, whether it was Gorbachev, Yeltsin, and of course, Vladimir Putin. And this is probably the tragedy that we have of the KGB under different names, but it's still very much with us. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this inspiring presentation. I think I'll start with some reflections and then questions. And the first reflection was actually about the defectors. You told us that you can actually count them on the one hand, or on fingers of one hand. I was thinking about Gordievsky, the famous one, yes. And actually, the story which occurred to me was about his idea why to defect, and then actually how he defected. And then I'll explain why I'm remembering this story. So when he was posted in the West, he actually, in his memoirs, wrote that I was able to read books like Nietzsche or some other prohibited philosophers, which I could never put my hand on the Soviet Russia. And every day I was able to go to listen to music, classical music, but not, let's say, the Swan, yes, I mean like the Tchaikovsky, but something more modern, something more exquisite, something not so trivial. So, and I'm quoting him obviously from my head, so I don't have the source right now, but I quoting him, I felt myself a human being for the very first time when I was there in the West. And then I remember that he was really shocked when he was actually recalled for some time back to the USSR. Very happy to get back. And so that is about the intellectual elite which represented the KGB. And also to the very same point goes another story about the very same guy. When he was running from the USSR, he did it in a car. He was actually in a trunk because he was transported to the via Finnish border from St. Petersburg. And actually the story was really dramatic. But when he crossed that border, the British attaché, I don't remember exactly, but the British man who took him out of the Soviet Union, he turned on Sibelius, the hymn of Finland. Yes, so that a guy there in the trunk realized that now he is in the West. I'm sure that not everyone can actually remember the tunes of the very same music. So that points to the intellectual level of a defector. So it is just like an illustration that actually I concur with your judgment that was intellectual elite of the Soviet Union.
Here I would say these are indeed well-known cases, but I distinguish. These are people who were familiar with the West in many ways, especially those who worked in the first directorate, which was in foreign espionage. But I had in mind when I was talking about internal defectors, people who did not have a chance to see the West and interact with the West, who dealt with the domestic arena. And I will give you two examples that are part of in my forthcoming book. One is the most famous, and he's been written about an interview based on the interviews that were done with him, a guy named Oryechov, that he was in the fifth directorate in charge of dissident. And he crossed the line. He started working with dissidents, warning them in advance when raids would be conducted. He helped them hide material. It took him, it took the KGB about 2 or 3 years to get on him. And then he was sentenced to 8 years in the camps, which broke him his health completely. He's alive. He's now in the States. But when he talks about it, what triggered him, and he was a diehard communist and patriot, and he enjoyed the KGB, he enjoyed serving them and enjoyed the power, and he felt that he was doing something good. But what changed him was the interactions with the dissidents that he was surveying. He was invited to parties with some of the luminaries of the dissident movement, and he started hearing different things. First of all, he saw normal people who speak differently, and the constant interaction for him was primary. The one thing that he states, the literature. It was Solzhenitsyn and it was Amalrik that started giving him problems because he was reading all this confiscated material. Others were not, by the way. Other simple people in the KGB read the same material, etc., and they said, you know, okay, they are not monsters, but they don't convince me that this is the future that we should go. In Ukraine, there was one guy who did it. His name was Shevchenko, and he also was put on the ice when he was in retirement already, and in retirement he started helping dissidents, warning them how to conduct themselves when they will be raided, when they will be interrogated. And of course, the KGB was on him. He stood his ground. He did not give an inch. We have all his material, of course, etc. Quite a brave person. And for him, it was mainly the contact with people like Lina Kostenko and other luminaries of the Shishyatyatniki, the 60ers, as they are called. He was an aspiring writer. He published several plays, etc. And that's what brought him into these circles. But the point is that I could mention you after years of research and talking to so many people, I can mention 2 names of people who, what I call internal defectors. We can mention other people that you mentioned, Gorodyevsky, Mitrokhin, Kalugin, etc. These are the people who were familiar with the West. Mitrokhin less so, but he was in the first directorate and an archivist, etc. So a slightly different story. But these are the internal, and the fact that I can come up with 2 all tells us one thing. One is the exposure to the internal dissent was a major factor. Second, that there are only 2, that the absolute majority were not moved, they remained loyal. They did not like the Communist Party, and that is something that I found very interesting. Inside the KGB, there was a lot of consternation and agitation against the so-called parashutniki, the party apparatchiks who were constantly brought from the party mid-career to the KGB. And that was part of the party securing control over the security organs. And it was done constantly. They didn't like them. They didn't like their mentality, their culture, etc. They viewed themselves, the career officers, as professionals, and now they have to deal with apparatchik who bring all these culture of party meetings and pak, and as they said, the blah blah culture and reporting in unpleasant atmosphere in among the ranks. So all of them, and that's you can find from Putin himself all the way to the people from Lithuania and Ukraine and Estonia, talking quite condescendingly on the party apparatchik who joined the KGB. Of course, I also talked with and read memoirs of people who came to the KGB from the party, and of course they have slightly more positive view of themselves. And they are, among the other things, take credit for taming the rough and tough guys, especially towards the end of the Soviet Union, the trigger-happy guys. So they take their political background as important in tempering the emotions.
Thank you. And also just continuing with the KGB story, and then, if you permit, we'll go back to the first book of yours, because I had a chance to read it, unlike the book on KGB, only an article. But thinking about the KGB, I remember there is a nice text by Andreas Glaser about the power and knowledge nexus and the failure of Stasi in the DDR, the Deutsche Demokratische Republik. And the point he is making that Stasi, one of the biggest counter-spy organization in the Soviet bloc, in the communist bloc, actually failed because they were locked in their own preconceptions. So they considered dissidents like enemies of the communist regime, whereas real dissidents were the ecologists, like eco movements, some culturalists. So they were not able to detect the threat correctly, and that is why the Stasi failed. So my question is, eventually we can say that KGB failed as well. They were not able to stop the dissolution of the Soviet USSR. So why did they fail?
I am slightly less supportive of this organization. They failed for sure, because in all cases, the communist regime collapsed, and they were supposed to prevent such an occasion. So there is no debate about it. But why? What is the main core? I would say, until the last moment, the KGB, the Stasi, the Securitate in Romania, and you just name it, all the other organizations in Eastern Europe and inside the Soviet Union, the KGB branches, they were the guys with the guns. They were the guys with the guns. Now, as I said, they did not use the guns for a long time. If we compare, for instance, the tragedy of the crime in Novocherkassk in 1962, when peaceful demonstrator who demonstrated under Lenin's banners, the red banners, were shot and buried in the middle of the night, and the KGB was part of this catastrophe, the KGB and the Red Army forces there who suppressed peaceful organization. As time moved on, they don't use their guns anymore. But nevertheless, when things begin to unravel in 90 and 91, They are still with the guns. They are still with the Spetsnaz, and they are still with all their forces, but they don't use them. And the point is why this is happening when they have at least the potential. And my interpretation is the collapse from the inside of the Kremlin and the Communist Party that basically left them leaderless. When we read the reports, the internal reports of the KGB, and by the way, among other things, in Ukraine, but not only from Soviet Ukraine, they are asking for guidance all the time. They are very militant. They don't like nationalism. You don't find many Ukrainian KGBists who are talking about supporting Ruch or supporting the move towards independence. That comes very, very, very late. Same goes for the Lithuanians, and these are the two republics who led the move towards sovereignty and independence. You don't find much support, but what they want is instructions. Tell us what to do. How do we deal with demonstrators? Should we stay out, as we are told? What does it mean to stay out, not to disperse them, not to use force? So what do we do? What do you want us to do? There is confusion. When the Lubyanka sent its inspectors to the provinces and the republics to see what to do, they see a confused organization. Okay. They see a confused organization that they are torn between opposition and the Communist Party. The Communist Party is becoming paralyzed, not effective. The opposition seems to be more dynamic. So even here, when there is the first Congress of Ruch, and take a guess that about 20% of the delegates are communists. The KGB, of course, monitors all of this, and they are simply confused what to do. So my interpretation is it starts from above. This is not to take anything from the courage and the bravery of the hundreds of thousands of people who fought for independence, who supported and started moving, especially after the catastrophe of Chernobyl. And when Ukrainian society is beginning to be more and more mobilized, and Ruch is coming to the scene, and certainly moving, although much more cautiously than, let's say, the Baltic republics. But we have to look at that. We have to look at the Ukrainian leadership at the time that was still waiting to see where things will go in the putsch. Was waiting to see. They already were talking about a new kind of the Soviet Union. Kravchuk already negotiating over Crimea and all these things at the time, how it will look like, etc. But they're still waiting to see. So for me, this is mainly the Communist Party, the collapse, the magnanimous collapse that triggered this issue with the KGB. And also one thing, and maybe I'm going a little bit too long with the answers here, but it's becoming a very bureaucratic organization, very wasteful. So when now historians come to the SBO archive, which I have only great things to say about this archive that is open for researchers, and we enjoy reading and getting the material that we order, or we go to the Baltic where it is all accessible. We read a lot, and the catch is, of course, not to be too mesmerized by this, because we read so much and we have to ask ourselves, but this is an intelligence organization. What does it do with all this information? And one of the things, it's too much information to digest. They gather information about so many things, and many of them are nonsensical. A lot of these prophylactica cases are nonsense, but they have to, they put a lot of human power, manpower to it, to investigate and to interrogate and all the stuff. They become an organization that produce papers on papers on papers. So one of my colleagues who studied in this case, the KGB archive of Lithuania, found that about 1/3 of the documents are documents about documents, what to do with documents, where to catalog them, how to catalog them, which is stunning. It is stunning. More than 1/3 is papers on papers on papers. And so this is, we have to take it against our image, conventional understanding of the KGB as rough and tough, the masculine, the guys with the guns, and also put it with the reality of an organization that become more and more bureaucratic and in a way lazy. Yeah.
Well, thank you. So the implosion of the leadership like the Communist Party and the paralysis or sclerosis by bureaucracy in the rank and files. That's what made them fail. Okay, thank you. And now, as I promised, to your book on the war, because while I was reading it, I thought that a chapter from your book will be really problematic for many Ukrainian readers. I'm referring to the chapter where you stipulated that the war, and now I'm quoting, provided Ukrainians with a powerful myth that both integrated them into the larger Soviet ethic and allowed for particularistic appropriations. End of the quote. So I hope you remember that particular passage. So what I'm trying to actually point to is that from the factual point of view, there was Zhdanovщина with its glorification of Russian culture, with the imposition of the Russian way of life as the blueprint for the Soviet way of life. And that Russification drive, it provoked an outcry, internationalism или Russifikaция, by Ivan Zyuba already in 1965. So what I'm trying to say that maybe it wasn't that successful to create that Ukrainian myth that allowed them to be both Ukrainians and Soviets. And secondly, if you take a longer historical perspective, and that's what I'm inviting you to do in your answer, you can see that when you claim, and I'm quoting you again, that due to the war, Soviethood and Ukrainianhood became synonymous, actually, that claim didn't age well, I think. Because if you consider first the late 1980s developments with the national revival in Ukraine, you can see that one could be a Ukrainian, but not a Soviet citizen. And moreover, if you consider the trajectory of independent Ukraine, you can see that nurturing a pro-Soviet identity often meant being an anti-Ukrainian. So what I'm trying to say that actually there was a disjuncture between being a Ukrainian and being a Soviet, having a Soviet identity. So finally, the question was on an introduction. 20 years after your book, how would you explain this? I would call it blindness, but I'm not trying to be rough. I'm just, saying what I'm seeing. So how would you explain that particular blindness to the non-Soviet Ukrainian nationhood? Did it have methodological reasons? Did your sources blindside you? Or maybe your thesis is still viable? How would you say?
Historians never admit mistakes, and I will be I will join them. But I would certainly stand by my argument. What is the book was about the experience of the Second World War and its legacy, and I certainly stand by it. What we are witnessing today, literally, and today means going back for the last, I would say, 15 years. That there is one person who is demolishing this ideology and myth, and this is Vladimir Putin. Demolishing it. We commemorated, I'm not a Russian or Ukrainian, but May 9th was commemorated just a few days ago. And it was the first time that it was done on ethno-national lines. And that was, I think, one of the tragedies of the fight and the defeat of the Nazis is now being ethno-nationalized. This is a Russian business and not anymore. And for many Ukrainians, without this war, keep in mind, before this criminal war against Ukraine started, millions of Ukrainians fought in the ranks of the Red Army. These millions of soldiers who fought in the ranks of the Red Army had families who supported them during the war. And I'm talking about tens of millions. The majority of Ukrainians were affiliated with this myth. And myth is not fabrication, of course. I'm talking about foundational myth as an idea that brings together a community. That community is based on it. There was the first and probably only blood bond between the regime and the population, based on the sacrifice in the war against the Nazis. And certainly there was a counter myth in the emerging, especially from the Western regions, especially Western Ukraine, all these territories that were annexed, occupied and annexed in 1939, that the cutting off Eastern Poland. They had a different idea. They had a different idea of what Ukraine should look like. But when we look at the trajectory of them, they basically made peace with the fact that their identity will be within the Soviet Union. The issue of separatism and sovereignty came very late. The fight for national dignity, culture, etc., from Ivan Juba, Kostenko, and all this was there. But I would say, and that may not be so popular, it was a minority view. It was a minority view that started taking root later on. But Ukrainian politics until recently was not structured this way. That not necessarily, I would say that it was a pro-Russian or people wanting to go back to the Soviet Union, certainly not. But there was a certain captivating idea of supranational myth that brought people together in the fight against the Nazi monstrosity that I believe was viable. And you could see it in the celebrations of May 9th in both countries, or all over the former Soviet Union, until recently, when Putin started completely Russifying it, and with this simply absurd criminal argument that he's going to denazify Ukraine. That's simply scratch your head with this argument. But basically, he's the one who is now turning it into upside down, and with the Russification of the myth of the Second World War. Keep in mind also that for many Ukrainians, the Second World War is, with all the sacrifice and the calamities, it is also the unification of Ukrainian land together. It was under Soviet Ukraine, but it's bringing Ukrainians in one territory under one roof. And that also is part of this mythology. So the cover of the book, if I remember it, you're talking about 20 years ago, is indeed of a Soviet soldiers, but pointing to Ukraina Vilna. That's Ukraine, but the entire Soviet Ukraine, a very popular poster at the time. So this is not to take anything from the merit, the intellectual merit, the courage of the Ukrainian dissidents who came on stage in the 1960s and kept their way and fought and paid terribly for this. Some of them died in psychiatric clinics and in the camps, etc. But they were not the majority of, and they were not the decisive factor in Ukrainian society, I would argue today. I would, if I have a moment, I would like to conclude with one quote from a Ukrainian KGB general that he was one of the first people I interviewed. The book will come out, his name is there, but I will spare you today, he's alive. And before we sat down and for the interview, he told me, I want to ask you a question. Yes, пожалуйста, please shoot. And he said, Yev Soyuz ili Slav Soyuz. And I was caught a little bit by surprise. That was on the eve of the Maidan. It was all debated, etc. So I tried to find my way out a little bit. I was not prepared. I said, Yev Soyuz значит Еврейский Союз. And he laughed and he said, no, Европейский Союз. And he said, what are you? Where should we go? And I said immediately, Yev Soyuz, Европейский Союз. He asked me why. I said, for your children, not for you. You've done well for yourself, but this is for your children, that they will live in a normal country, in a free, democratic, etc. And he looks at me, big guy, and waves his finger in front of my face and said, no, you don't understand. We do not belong with the West. We belong with Russia and Belarus. And I told him, Russia with Putin? He said, no, of course, without Putin. I told him that doesn't count. He said, and so I felt a little bit more on a roll, and I said, but also with Kazakhstan, because at the time they were talking also about Kazakhstan. I said, Kazakhstan? Of course not. So I said, okay, so wishful thinking. What I want to say, this state of mind, especially with security services, but not only, was very strong about it, that there is also a certain Slavic unity that the Second World War brought together. And it was cultivated and it was felt very strong until simply Putin started turning into restoration of the Russian Empire, not the Soviet Union, but of the Russian Empire, and basically demolishing the one foundational element of his own legitimacy. The most important, I would say.
Thank you. Just a consideration that I concur that the dissidents actually were a minority. It is true, but it is only natural because actually Bolsheviks, they used to be a minority as well, and they managed to impose their own myth only when they started controlling the state apparatus. Actually, it is a typical constructivist approach. I mean, you have a state, then you have a means to create the identity. If you have a project, how to this identity to make. So it's only natural.
I agree with you. I would say simply that for instance, if we take a look at the Russian Federation, it is the dissidents there never came to power. The dissidents themselves. It was not Sakharov and Alexeyeva and Kovalyov and all these major figures in the dissident movement who came to power. But there was Gorbachev and Yakovlev who came to power. People who were not necessarily, they bought the entire package of the dissident movement, but they took some elements of it, certain parts of it. And this was important. In Ukraine, it was much more torturous passage. Much more torturous passage, not necessarily, it will be somewhat of a stretch to claim that the late Kravchuk, who just passed away, or Kuchma, etc., they were influenced or by any way by the ideas of Drach, and you just name it, all the leaders of the Ukrainian dissident movement. And I would say this is still a work in progress, and we'll see, and we all cross our fingers that Ukraine will emerge from this criminal catastrophe that is inflicted on it, not only as a united nation and unified nation and territory, but also democratic and liberal. And I certainly hope so. But the fight over the legacy of the dissident movement in Ukraine is still a work in progress.
Well, here I have nothing to object because this is my reading of the situation as well. Actually, there are so many questions I would like to ask you, but I think we are running out of your time. It is like 1 hour and 15 minutes we are talking. And I think you might want to go. You have some other duties, I suppose. So I'm grateful for your presentation. I think we are here in Ukraine expecting to see your book published, and I will definitely be the one who is eager to read it.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. And as I say, we give a lot of talks and a lot of efforts to Ukraine. We are all behind you and wish you the best. And I really hope and believe that you will prevail. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for solidarity. Thank you.
Okay.
Ciao.